This is an OCR A-level biology video on communication and homeostasis. In this video we're going to go through the whole topic, looking at communication and homeostasis, looking at feedback and endo and ectotherms, and in a separate video we're going to move on to 5.2, but that will not be in this video. So let's start with a blank canvas here and get straight into it with communication homeostasis. So all living things need to maintain a suitable temperature, a suitable pH, an aqueous environment to keep substrates and products in solution, and they need freedom from toxins and excess inhibitors. Failure to do this will lead to cell inactivity and or death. These specialised cells, especially in multicellular organisms, need to be able to communicate with each other. When we're dealing with communication, we're looking at stimuli and responses. And stimuli can be caused by a change in an external environment or a change in the internal environment. So let's compare those two sort of stimuli. So let's look at internal first. So most cells and tissues are not exposed to the external environment. They are protected by epithelial tissues and organs, such as the skin and bark in plants. They are bathed in tissue fluid. Okay, so products of metabolism are toxic and unwanted, so you get lactic acid, carbon dioxide, that builds up in this tissue fluid, which is internal. And cells have to adapt and change their own environments in response to this stimulus. So, for example, if we look back at CO2 buildup, if CO2 builds up, it lowers the pH of tissue fluid, altering enzyme and protein function. So that is an issue, that is a stimulus, and it has to be changed. So accumulation acts as a stimulus for an increased breathing rate to remove CO2. So that's how we can internally detect stimuli, changes in the environment, and then deal with it. So breathe faster to get rid of more CO2. Then we can have a look at external environment. So a change in the external environment puts pressure on the organisms to change their behaviour or physiology to reduce the stress being put on them. So an environmental change is a stimulus, whereas the change in behaviour and physiology is the response. For example, if we're looking at a gradual season change in environment causes a gradual response. So you can get a thick winter coat or a thin summer coat in like Arctic wolves and stuff like that. But we can also have rapid external responses. So when a rabbit goes into its burrow, it's just been in bright sunlight and it goes into the burrow, the eye's vision has to adapt really quickly to this change in light. It's not something you want to gradually change, you need it to be a rapid sort of reflex response. But so that's the main thing. External are to do with the external environment, stimuli, but there can be gradual changes which you gradually adapt to, or there can be rapid changes. Next we're going to look at coordinating activities of different organs within our multicellular organisms, really. So multicellular organisms are much more efficient than single cellular organisms because multicellular organisms have differentiated cells, and you should know about that from unit 2.6. So we've got this basic process you know from GCSE. So we have cells, they differentiate into different types of cells which form tissues when they're all working together. Tissues that all work together form organs, and a bunch of organs that work together form an organ system. So multicellular organisms require communication systems, and these communication systems need to be across the whole body. They need to enable cells to communicate with one another, enable specific communication, rapid communication, and both long and short-term responses. And usually short-term responses are nervous responses, whereas long-term are more hormonal responses. But that is generally. There are examples of some that I'm not sure, which I can't think on the top of my head, but there are. So don't just assume all hormonal responses are slow. They genuinely are, and all nervous responses only last a short while, because not all of them do. So let's look at homeostasis. So homeostasis is maintaining conditions within the body despite external and internal changes. So there's a list of things about to come up here, and all things that are involved in homeostasis. So there's maintenance of body temperature, which we call thermoregulation, and you probably recognise that word. Blood glucose concentration, blood salt concentration, water potential of the blood, blood pressure, CO2 concentration. And you notice that these three here, looking at blood glucose, blood salt, a lot to do with our kidneys there, which will be in the next video. One more thing to look at for homeostasis is we've got this at the bottom: stimulus receptor communication pathway. So that's our standard response pathway. So the signal from the receptor to the communication pathway we call our input, and from the communication pathway to the effector we call our output. So what's going in to the communication pathways input, what's leaving the communication pathways are output, and that goes to our effector. The stimulus is typically picked up by sensory receptors, which monitor changes within the environment. So we have loads of different sensory receptors which pick up stimuli, and off the top of my head, so we've got like temperature receptors in the blood, we've got stretch receptors, proprioceptors, detecting, and muscle spindles detecting like muscles moving, detecting movement, stuff like that. They're all over the body. Pressure sensors, I think we call them Purkinje corpuscles. If you want to look into depth more around this topic, you're probably in the wrong place, because that is going to be on unit 5.5, I think, 5.3, on neurons, and I have done another video on that if you want to watch it. This is showing a hormonal response, this diagram here, but to be honest, I'd made this page and I thought it looked incredibly pretty compared to my usual work, and I had a massive gap with no text to fill in, so I just put this picture in to make it look pretty. Okay, so that is the outline of communication and homeostasis. One thing I want to look at is feedback, which it couldn't fit on this page, it couldn't fit in this tiny little box. So let's move on to feedback. So there's two forms of feedback. There's positive feedback and negative feedback. And this is a picture of negative feedback, which is where we're going to start. So negative feedback is any change from the optimal conditions. They must be reversed to return to conditions to the optimum, which sounds complicated, but it's literally just reversing the change we detect, which is pretty much most of our homeostatic responses. So, for example, if it's too hot, we sweat, it cools us down. So the stimulus was being too hot, and we counterbalance that by sweating, and we cool it down. So that's negative feedback. Another example is if we've got high CO2, we increase our expiration, and then we have low CO2. Another one which I've not put on this page, like high blood glucose, we detect it, release insulin, and then we get low blood glucose levels, okay, because of the actions of insulin. If you want to look more of that, that's in a different video. I'm not going to try and list the numbers off, but I'm pretty sure it should be easy to find hormonal responses. So let's have a really quick look at this diagram. It's taken from my notes. I've got happy faces and a sad face. So at this point here, we've got a happy face. We're in our optimum condition. We get a change from our optimum condition. So we get some feedback, sensory receptor detects this change, it sends the input to the communication system, usually our CNS. The output gets sent to the effector, which changes this, and it returns it back to the optimum. So if we apply that to heat, we're at our optimum temperature. It gets too hot. This is the feedback we get. We detect it's too hot. We tell our communication system it's too hot. That sends output to the effector molecule, which could be our sweat glands. They release sweat. It cools us down. We return back to our optimum. We're happy again. So that's negative feedback. We get negative feedback, so we try and fix that and just turn it back to our optimum. Okay, pretty easy to understand. Positive feedback is the opposite, and it's less common within the body, within homeostasis, thermoregulation certainly. Positive feedback is more when we detect a change, and so the stimulus is a change from the optimum, and what we end up doing is increasing that change, which you may think is ridiculous, but it does happen. So enzymes have an optimum temperature, and in their optimum temperature they have a high rate of reaction and they create heat. Okay, so lots of heat is produced by enzymes. When it gets cool, so when we get a low temperature, we end up getting a lower rate of reaction, because you should know that effect of enzymes. I've not done that video, but it should be coming in a few days' time. And that reduces the amount of heat they produce, because they're not reacting, less heat's produced, so it gets even cooler. And then the temperature is even lower. The rate of reaction gets even lower. It gets even colder. And that just keeps repeating. Okay? I hope that makes sense. Another one, which I'm not writing on here, I don't think I wrote it on here, is women with the cervix, and I did write it here. So as the cervix begins to stretch, this causes the posterior pituitary gland to secrete a hormone, oxytocin, which increases the uterine contractions and stretches the cervix even more, which causes the secretion of more oxytocin, and this keeps happening until the cervix is fully dilated. And that is helpful, obviously, because women need to dilate their cervix to get the baby out. Otherwise, they'd be in even more pain than they already are. So, positive feedback, we get a stimulus and we end up increasing that stimulus, and it just ends up in a cycle of constantly increasing the stimulus received. So enzymes is the best example there. And for negative feedback, we get a change in stimulus and we just want to change it back to our optimum. So that's feedback. One final thing we're going to look at here is thermoregulation, not in too much depth, but just comparing ectotherms and endotherms. And once again, I've took a picture of my notes. A, this helps prevent any copyright, and B, I'm lazy. And C, it's actually quite a good table if you can read my handwriting. Luckily I can read my handwriting, so I'll just go through this, everything it says to you anyway. Let's compare exotherms to endotherms. So, for example, ectotherms are more like reptiles, lizards, cold-blooded animals really. Endotherms are warm-blooded animals. Okay, so ectotherms are dependent on external sources of heat, and their body temperature fluctuates. So their temperature is always changing. It's going from hot to cold. If you've ever had a pet lizard or something, I know my cousin did, they bask in their vivarium under the light, so then they get warmer. So they're dependent on like the sun and heat, and generally you will only find them in tropical climates. Endotherms are independent of the external temperature and they control their temperature separately. The body temperature remains very stable, and in humans, you should probably know body temperature is always about 37 degrees. Different sources tell you different things. I've probably got that wrong, should know it, but luckily it's not in our course. So let's see how these two different types of organisms adapt to different temperatures. So when it's too cold, ectotherms move into a sunny area. They lie on warm surfaces. They expose larger surface area to the sun. They just spread out and bask in the sun, basically. And at night, they move into their burrows, okay, which will be warmer, because it's been absorbing the sun's heat all day. It'll be warmer underground than it will be outside. Endotherms, they change their behaviour like ectotherms, so they can roll into a ball to reduce heat, but mainly endotherms, the thing that makes them so efficient is their body can just adapt itself. So we can sweat, trap humid air with hairs and feathers to prevent convection currents sweeping that hot air trapped from the surface of your skin away. Vasoconstriction, so constricting the blood vessels into the body towards the core of the body, so the extremities like your fingertips and your feet, they get cold first. You draw blood away from those sorts of areas and you bring it to your central cord just to make sure all your vital organs are staying warm, and they pant less, which is a behavioural change, and increased respiration and muscle contraction. So endotherms rely on respiration basically to create heat, because metabolic reactions generate a lot of heat, so they've got to eat a lot of food, and we'll see that at the end here. Muscle contraction also produces a lot of heat, because contracting your muscles uses respiration. Just going to look at these advantages and disadvantages each. I think most people would argue endotherms are more advanced than ectotherms, but some advantages for ectotherms is they can survive with less food, as they don't need to respire as much, they just rely on the external temperature. So more energy can be converted to growth, and they survive long without food. And if we compare this to endotherms and their disadvantages, they need more food because they have chances of overheating, which is that it's harder to deal with being too hot than too cold. A little amount of food goes towards biomass, okay, so because they're constantly respiring just to generate enough heat to stay alive, little food goes towards biomass growth. Therefore typically takes endotherms longer to grow, their life cycles are much longer, they're much less efficient at storing food energy because they're always using it. So an advantage of endotherms, though, they keep a constant temperature, they can remain always active and can live in colder parts of the planet. And ectotherms is pretty much the opposite there. So disadvantages, they're less active because they have to stay out of, they can't exercise too much as they're going to generate too much heat and they will overheat, okay, and they're more vulnerable to predation as they can't run too much. They've got to try and stay cool. So finally, let's look at how endotherms can thermoregulate. Well, I've just let this run out because I want to start from the bottom first. So in endotherms, they've got this thermoregulatory centre, which is in the hypothalamus. So the thermoregulatory centre, let me just speak you through this. So thermoregulatory centre basically picks up the changes. So the changes in blood and core body temperature. It also has peripheral receptors which feed to it, so give it an input of external temperature. It passes this on to the hypothalamus because the thermoregulatory centre is in the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus then sort of generates the impulse, so sort of makes the decision. It generates an impulse via nerves to be rapid to the effector, which reverses the change. And so that's negative feedback again. And some of the effector things that the hypothalamus controls is metabolism levels. It can control muscular contraction levels and vasoconstriction and vasodilation. That is all on Unit 5.1. Next video I'm going to be looking at 5.2, which carries on quite nice from here, including excretion, liver and the kidney. See you next time.